Hey guys, in this video, we're going to learn about user-defined functions. So you've actually already been using a couple functions, whether you realize it or not, and we're going to do some examples together. We're going to actually create our own functions. So I'm going to open idle, and remember we've got to go to File, New File, and let me get rid of this. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And these are going to be our function examples. And I will put this in the module when I'm done. Alrighty, so I'm going to come up here, make my text a little bit bigger, and let's talk about some of the functions that we've already been using, maybe without even realizing exactly how they were working. So let's see, let's just say these are some Python functions. So there's a couple different kinds of functions. We're going to focus on two. We're going to focus on the functions that come already built into Python, and then we're going to talk about how we can make our own functions. Those are called user-defined functions. So some of the ones that you've already been using so far in Python are going to be maybe the print function. Remember that every function in Python gets a set of parentheses after the name of the function. And if you're using idle, function names will turn purple. That's different for different IDEs or different environments that you may be coding in, but specifically in Python, they turn purple. Now, if you guys remember, we have to actually give some information to this function before it can do anything. If we just run it right now, it's just going to print a blank line. You probably won't even be able to tell that anything's happening, but it's going to give you a blank line. All right, so we have to give at least one parameter to the print function if we want to get something onto the screen. And what we've been printing so far, so the parameter that we've been providing to the print function is a string. So it could be an F string or it could be one of the basic strings that we learned way back in the beginning. So I don't need to print a variable right now. I don't have any variables even if I wanted to print one, but I can go ahead and put a string in here. So I'll just say hello FTCC. All right. So this string is a parameter. It's a piece of information that the print function needs in order to do its job. All right, and we've passed in here one parameter. This string here just counts as one thing, one parameter, it's just one string. The print function actually can take a second parameter, can take a couple different ones. So we haven't actually been doing this for the most part. When you use this print function, by default, whether you realize it or not, it's adding a new line character onto the end. So say I was to do another print function, and I just say, let's say good day. This, if I print these right now, both of these, they're going to be on separate lines. All right. But we can pass a second parameter to the print function, and we can say, hey, instead of ending with a new line, I want you to end with just a blank space. So that's going to have this line, the hello FTCC line print. Instead of adding a new line onto the end of it, we're just going to have a space. And then this next print statement here is going to execute. So I know that I'm passing in two parameters up here because we've got one, which is the string. And then we have this comma here. The comma is very important. If you pass more than one parameter to a function, they have to be separated by a comma. All right. You may be wondering why we're able to just pass this string in right here as is, but when we do pass in this parameter for the end, I have to put the name and then an equal sign. So these are two different types of parameters. This one here is just going to be, Python knows what to do with it because it comes first. It's the first parameter, and Python's expecting in this print function for the first parameter to be whatever we want to print out. This one here is going to be a keyword parameter. You'll also see parameters and argument. That word can be used sort of interchangeably, For our purposes, we're going to say we can use them interchangeably. So if you see a keyword argument, that means that somewhere in this function definition where this print function was actually created, so in the depths of Python, there is actually a definition of how this print function should operate. It has a parameter called end. And what we're doing is we're saying, hey, for the parameter that's called end, we're going to give a blank space. All right, so you don't always have to use these keywords when you send the parameters to the function, but sometimes you'll see it like that, okay? For the purposes of this class, we're not going to use keyword functions, or keyword arguments, but you know what they are now. So let's look at another function that we've been using a lot. So we use the sum function in a couple of our assignments, and if you guys remember, in order to see the sum, I'm going to have to wrap the sum inside of a print function. All right, so I've got my sum function here, and it's going to take in a list of numbers. All right, so I'm going to use my square brackets to make a list, and I'm going to pass a couple numbers in here. All right, this is going to print the sum of 1, 2, and 3. So if I actually just could take this part out here, and I can, let me cut this out, and I put it here instead. This is just the sum function without it being wrapped in that print statement or print function. So what we're passing to it is actually only one parameter. We're passing in a list as one parameter. All right. Even though there are commas inside of here, well, the commas are only there because these are 3 different values within a list, and the different values in the list have to be separated. If I wanted to put a second parameter, I would have a comma here, and then I would type in whatever my second parameter is. All right, but the sum function only really requires one parameter, which is that list, and it's going to add up all the numbers in the list. So let me put it back inside the print function, and let's run it. So we're first going to see this string here. It won't have a new line at the end. It'll just have a space, and then we'll see this string here, right? And then immediately after that, we will see the sum of the numbers 1, 2, and 3. Let's give it a run. All right, very nice. So let's talk about how we can actually create our own functions. All right, so I'm going to make a comment, and this is going to be a user-defined function. All right, so this isn't built into Python anywhere. We're going to create it, and then we're going to use it. By the way, whenever you are actually using a function like this, we call it calling the function. So here you can say we called the print function. Here you could say we called the sum function. And these parameters, we can say that we pass the parameters to the function. So in this case, we can say that we have this list here, and we're passing this list to the sum function. So in order to create our own function, it first has to start with the keyword def, D-E-F, and that stands for define. We're about to define a function. So I'm going to call this function, what can we do with it? We'll just do a little bit of math, all right? I'm just going to call it math. All right. Hopefully Python will let us use the word math. I think it will. So let's say that we're going to pass in 2 numbers to this math function. So when we're creating it, we're going to say that it has to have at least, or it has to have 2 parameters, exactly 2 parameters actually, in order to do its job. We're going to pass to it a num1 and a num2. These are variables. We have no clue right now what num1 and num2 are going to be. All right, but before we can actually call this function and use it, we will have to create 2 variables, num1 and num2, before we can pass them into the function. We won't do that until we actually call the function. Right now, we're just creating it. So let's say that when this function executes, we're going to take whatever num1 was, and let's say we're going to just add 5 to it. All right, now actually, if I'm going to do that, I've got to have a variable over here so we can save the sum of those 2 numbers. So I'll just call it my sum. All right, and we're taking whatever num1 is and we're adding 5 to it. So now let's divide whatever my sum is by num2. All right, so I'm just going to call this the solution because this will be our final answer. And we're going to say, okay, let's take whatever my sum was, this variable over here, and we're going to now divide it by num2. All right, very simple. Now, we're going to make this function return a value, and then we'll talk about it after we actually execute it. So we have this variable here called solution, and it's going to hold the sum of this, right? And then we took that sum, and we're going to divide that by whatever our num2 is. We want to return the solution from this function, all right? So what we need to do is call the function. So just because we typed this function and we described its logic and we created it, it's not actually going to execute, or the code inside of there is not going to run until we call the function. So until you call it, it's just kind of sitting over there, hanging out, waiting for you to use it. All right. Just to prove that, let me go ahead and run it right now, and you'll see that nothing has changed from the last time we ran it. All right. So what we need to do now is call the function. So I'm going to say call the math function. Now, since this function is going to return a value to us, that means that when we call the function, some kind of number or data or some kind of value is going to be given back to us. All right, so if we just wanted to call the function and we didn't want to return anything from it, we would just call it by its name, math. And remember that every function has a set of parentheses after it. This is where we put our parameters if any are required. We can look back up here into the function that we just made, and we can see that we have to send it 2 numbers in order for it to work. So look what happens if I try to call the function, but I don't send in the parameters. All right, we've got an error here, and it says, hey, in line 19, you've got a problem because this math function is missing 2 required positional arguments, num1 and num2. So positional only means that we know num1 should come first and num2 should come second, right? Remember this, the positional arguments, you don't have to put the name of the argument in front of it like we did for the end. Anyways, just know that there are 2 values missing from the math function, so it can't do its job. So let's give it 2 numbers and then let's see what happens. Let's pass in a 4 and a 2. All right, I'm gonna run it, but still nothing is happening, right? The reason that nothing is happening is because this function is not printing anything or displaying anything to the screen, right? There's no print statements in here anywhere. So what we have to do is realize that it's going to return a value back to us. So when we call this math function, it's going to throw back whatever number this math produces. We don't have anywhere to save it, nor are we printing it out anywhere. So I'm going to first say, okay, I'm going to call a new variable down here. I'm going to call it the solution. And I'm going to say is equal to the math function if we pass a 4 and a 2. So now whatever value this function returns is going to have a place to be saved. It's going to be saved as the solution. All right, so what I need to do now is I've got to print out whatever the solution is. All right, so we can see it. The math is still happening and everything, but unless we write a print function or print statement, we don't actually see the value. All right, so now I've created a variable to hold the value that's returned from the function. And then I'm calling the function, providing the 2 parameters that it requires to do its job. Then I'm taking whatever the solution was and I'm printing it out. All right, so let's give it a run and let's see what happens. All right, so the answer that it's giving us is 4.5. That's this part right here. Let's check and make sure that the math is correct. So first we take 4 plus 5, right? That makes my sum equal 9. And then we're taking that 9 and we're dividing it by 2. And that does in fact give us 4.5. So the 4.5 is saved over here in the solution. right? Because this was 9 divided by 2. That gives us 4.5 saved in the solution variable. And then we're going to return whatever that value is. For us, this time around, it happens to be 4.5. We're going to return it. So wherever we call the function here, it's returning 4.5. And if we want to use that later in our code, we've got to save it in a variable. So that's why I've got the solution over here. And then I just simply print out whatever that value is. All right, so let's make another function, but let's make this one a non-value returning function. All right, so I'm going to keep going, and I'm actually going to give myself some room down here. All right, cool. So we're going to have a non-value returning function. Apologies if you guys can hear noise. We got some construction going on outside. So this time, we'll use some strings this time instead, or maybe we'll pass in one string and one number. So we'll make our function require a string and a number. All right, so let's just call this one greetings. All right. And always a function has a set of parentheses afterwards. This is where we put any parameters or essentially information that this function may need to do its job. So let's tell Python we're going to pass in a name. Keep in mind, I'm just creating these variables here. You can call these whatever you want, okay? These are up to you to name and decide whatever parameters your function needs. You are the creator of all of this function, all right? So we're going to give a name, and then we'll just say we're going to give an age. All right. So since this function is not going to return any values, we need to write some print statements inside of it so that we can at least see some sort of action going on. All right, so this time I'm going to simply put in here a print statement. I'm going to call the print function, and this time I'm going to print my variables name and age. So I am going to use an F string this time. So you use the F string when you want to print variables. All right, so we'll say hello, and then we'll say whatever name the user passed in when the function is called, and we'll say you are however many. So we'll use our age parameter there, years old. Right? Since this function is not going to return a value, we do not need a return statement in there like we had in the previous one. This right there is all you need. So a couple of things to note. Any code that belongs inside of this function needs to be indented one time. All right, if I had it like this, it would not work. Python would not recognize that print function as being inside of the greeting function definition. So in order to say, hey, this code should execute when we call the greetings function, it needs to be indented. So does any other line of code that belongs inside of that function. So if we scroll up to our other one, see how all these lines are indented? And that's because all of these lines of code belong to this math function. Then when we're done creating our function, when we've written all the code that needs to happen for that function, we then come back out all the way to the left margin, and then we know that we are no longer inside of that function. You never want to call a function from inside of itself. So you do not, when you call this function down here, you do not want it to be indented like that. All right, it needs to be all the way against the left margin. And every time you create a new function, so say I was, let's say I can move my greetings function up a little bit. Let's say I'm going to put one function right after another. I would need to bring my cursor all the way back to the left margin before I start creating a new function. All right. So we'll just leave these couple statements here where we call the math function. We'll just leave those. All right. And maybe I'll put one blank line in here before we call the greeting function. So since we're not returning anything, we do not have to put a variable out here on the left-hand side of our function when we call it this time. I'm just going to say greetings. All right, and I've got to put a set of parentheses. Now I actually need to pass in some sort of name and some sort of age. So I'll use my name. And, all right. So since we're using age in a string, and strings work best with other strings, right? We don't have to convert anything. I'm actually going to put my age in here as a string as well. All right, so let's throw that in there. Now when we call the function, what's going to happen is control of the program is no longer going to actually be here. It's going to go up to where we defined the greetings function. So it's going to come up here. The literal control of the program comes to here, and it says, okay, so they're trying to call this function, and they're passing in this and this. So let me replace name with the actual string that they gave me, Mallory, and let me replace age with the string 34. So when you call this function, it's taking whatever information you put in here, and it's substituting it for these values here. And since Mallory was the first parameter, that becomes the name. And since 34 was the second parameter, that becomes the age. That's that positional argument that it was talking about before. That's how it knows that Mallory is name and Mallory is not age, right? So let's run this code right here. Remember, this is still going to print out. We'll still get a little bit of stuff from before, but we're looking for a string that says, hello, Mallory, you are 34 years old, right? And this is the code that's going to cause that to happen, this line right here. So let's give it a run, and let's see if we did everything correctly. All right, it looks like we did. So we have exactly what we were expecting. Hello, Mallory, you are 34 years old. So it successfully took those parameters when we called the function, and it replaced them for name and age. And you can throw anything in here. So one of the benefits of creating these functions is that if you have a piece of code and you need to use it over and over and over again in your program, you don't have to keep typing it out every time. You can just put it inside of a function and you can call it whenever you need it. So let's say we said Joshua is 20 years old. All right, let's give it a run. And voila, right? Joshua is the name and 20 was the age. All right. Keep in mind that we're writing very short functions here. They're only a few lines long. If you continue programming and you advance, you will see functions that are very, very long and very intricate. So it might not make a lot of sense right now while we would need to create a whole function just to print this string every time. But keep in mind that some functions are, 50, 100, even more lines long. So you wouldn't want to type those same 50 lines every single time. You would want to put them in a function so you can call it. You can just pass whatever information is needed, and then you can execute that code over and over and over again without having to retype it every time. All right. So let's see, what else can we talk about functions here? We've talked about parameters. We've talked about how to create a function using the def keyword. We've talked about functions that do return a value and those that don't. Let's maybe do one more just for practice. We'll make this function print to the screen and also return something. So it will be a value returning function. All right, so let's say we'll do one more value returning function. All right, and I'm going to call this one my cats. All right, we'll talk about all the cats that I have. So I'm going to actually say to this function, it's going to need a cat list. All right, so what I'm actually going to pass in when I call this function is a list of the names of my cats. When you create the function, Python really doesn't know what kind of data type or data structure you're going to be passing in. It doesn't know if cat list is a number, a name, or a string, a float. It has no idea. A list, a dictionary. The way it knows is it pretty much tries to run with whatever you pass in when you call the function. And if that doesn't work, it's going to throw an error. All right. And we'll do an example of that when we call this function. But we know as the programmer that we're supposed to be passing a list in here. And we can actually come inside of this function, and I'm going to make a comment in here. So these are called document strings. We're not going to do it in its entirety, but let's at least put a comment in here that says what kind of data type or data structure this function is expecting and what sort of data type it's going to return. All right, so let's say that the input to this function needs to be a list of names. In my case, cat names. All right, since I used the 3 quotation marks, this is a multi-line comment, so I can come right back over here and I can keep typing and it will still be a comment. And we'll say that the function is going to return a string. All right, and I've got to close up my 3 quotation marks. Now I'm done with that comment, which is not going to be executed by Python, right? That's for us humans. Now I'm going to actually write the code that's going to be inside of my cats function. So since cat list is going to be a list, we can use a for loop to iterate over that list. All right, so I'm going to say for cat in my cats. Remember, for loop. It's going to iterate all the way through my list. So right now, when I run this code and it looks for the list, I'm sorry, I apologize. This should be called cat list. Sorry about that because that's the name of my list. So this is going to be the part that changes every time we go to a new thing in the list, right? So that's going to be my variable that's actually going to hold whatever value we're currently on in the list. And it's going to iterate, it'll start at the first thing in the list and we'll go all the way to the last thing in the list. So how about we just print whatever that cat's name is. All right, so all this is going to do is iterate through our list and it's going to print each cat name that it sees in the list. All right, awesome. So we also said that this function is going to return a value and it's going to return a string. So let's make a string and return it. So I'm going to start with my keyword return. All right, anytime you want your function to return a value, you need to put the keyword return, put a space, and then put whatever it is you want the function to return. So I'm going to say, when we call the function, it's going to print out all the name of our cats, right? It's not going to return those, but it's going to print them out. So let's return a string that says, we're going to return however many items are in that list. So how many cats do I have? I have, do you guys remember this? I need to make this an F string out here so that I can use my length function in here. So I'm going to say the length of whatever my cat list is. That's how many cats I have. All right. So if you guys remember a couple modules ago, we used this length function and all it does is tell us how many items are in the list that we pass to it. So this also, length is a function, right? It's a function that takes in one parameter and that is a list and it counts up the number of items in that list and then that's the value that it returns, okay? So it's actually going to print out the number of items in my list. And I do need to have it inside of these curly braces here because I'm using a variable inside of here. So I've got to have the curly braces. So I've got my little f out here. So let's go ahead and call this function. Remember, you got to back all the way up to the left margin. All right, and we called it my cats. But also remember that it's returning a string. So if it's returning something, we need to create a variable that can hold whatever's returned from the function. So I'll just call it my string equals. Now I got to call my function. Remember, we call it by its name. This one is called my cats, and it needs to take in a list. So I'm actually just going to copy that. I'm going to paste it in. We cannot just keep this in here like this. We have to actually pass a list in there. All right, so I'm going to do things a little bit differently this time. Let's go ahead and create the list above, and then we'll assign the list to a variable. We'll pass the variable into the function. So I'll call this, we can call it cat list down here as well. All right, remember that it has to actually be a list, and mine's going to be a list of strings. All right, so I've got Yoshi, Got Moon Pie. We've got Betty, William, Sally, and Pebbles. All right, so I've got my list of strings here. It looks good, and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 names of cats in there. And then I take that list and I assign it to a variable called cat underscore list. Now my function is expecting a list, so let me pass into it cat underscore list. So we have to create this variable and assign a list to it before we can use that variable name as our parameter, right? So when this function runs, control of the code, when it hits here, it's going to come all the way up to here where we define the mycats function, and it's going to start running the code inside of that function. So it's going to take that list and it's going to iterate through each thing in the list, and it's going to print it out. And then it's going to return the string I have, right, however many cats. So since we saved that string here, we need to actually print it out down here because we won't be able to see it unless we print it out. All right, so let's give this code a run and let's see what happens. It should go ahead and print every cat name in my list as well as return the string here, and then we've actually printed out the string. All right, so let's give it a run. All right, so we still have this piece of code up here about hello Joshua, you are 20 years old. Remember that that is actually separate. Let me put a space in there. I write an empty print function. That should give me a space. All right, here we go. So all this code from Yoshi all the way down, this is the code that's, or the output that's being displayed for the mycats function, right? So it did exactly what we thought. It printed every name in the list. That's the for loop that's doing that there, right? Our for loop is printing all the cat names. And then this string right here is being returned from the function. We saved it as my string, and then we printed it out. Hey you guys, so I forgot one very important function, and that is the main function. So before in the other examples, we were not using a main function, but every program that you write from here on out should have a main function, and that is where the majority of the logic of your program is going to live. And from inside of this main function that I have here, I'm calling another function, calc dozen. All right, so let's talk about this code and what it does and why we need a main function. So I have a function that I've created up here called calc dozen, and it's going to require one parameter, which is num cookies. Right? Let's take a look at this doc string that I have here describing this function. So it says this function takes in an integer value representing an amount of cookies. It then displays a float value to the user describing how many dozens of cookies they have. All right, so what we're going to do is when we call this function, we're going to have to pass in one parameter, and it should be an integer, a whole number. All right, then inside of that function, we have a print statement, and actually, I did not do this correctly. We've got to indent all the code inside of this calc dozen function. Now we got it looking good. All right, so we've got a print statement here. It says you have however many, whatever this value is here that we pass in, you've got that many cookies in the jar. Let's see how many dozen that is. So we take our num cookies, which should be an integer, and we divide it by 12 because that's how many cookies are in a dozen. And then we save that value here in our variable called num dozen. And then that is the value that our function is going to return. All right, so we give a number of cookies and it's going to return to us how many dozen cookies we have. So down here, I actually have my main function. And this is where I'm going to hold all the main logic in my program. It does not take in any parameters, and it almost never takes in any parameters. So when you're creating these main functions, remember that you don't have to pass anything in here to it. All right. So what's happening here is inside the main, we are calling our function that we just created up there called calc_dozen. And since it requires one parameter, and we know that that should be an integer, I'm going to pass in 47. All right, so what's going to happen is when we call this function, control of the program will actually come up to the function definition, and it will find the code inside, and it will start executing, replacing num cookies with 47. So in this example, it would say you have 47 cookies in a jar. Let's see how many dozen that is. And then we'll take the 47, divide it by 12. It doesn't go evenly. No matter what, this division is going to give us back a float value, so a number with a decimal in it. It'll tell us how many dozen cookies that we have, and the function is going to return that number. Since the function is returning a value, we need to assign a variable here on the left-hand side of our function call so that whatever value is returned is saved here in our variable that I've called how many dozen. All right, whatever value or variable name that you're returning, you do not have to call the variable in the main the same name. All right, you can call this whatever you want to. Just know that it's going to be storing this value right here. All right. And then again, inside of our main, after we have ran or called this function, and now we have a value for how many dozen, we're just going to simply print that out. You have however many dozen cookies. All right. Now, just because you define a function does not mean that the code inside of that function is going to run. In order to actually run the function, we have to call it. And remember, we call a function by its name, and the main function is no different. All right, we've called main and we've got our empty parentheses out there. But the main function is a little bit different in the way that you call it. So what we want to do is we want to make an if statement. All right, and this if statement is saying if, this is a double underscore right here. If double underscore name double underscore is equal to, these are also double underscores. All right, and keep in mind that this is in quotation marks, so this is a string. All you really need to know about this right now is that this if statement is going to make sure that this main right here is the one that executes. Sometimes in Python, you'll have multiple Python programs or files working together, and there may be a main function in both of the Python files. And we're just specifying to Python, hey, when we say run the main function, we mean this one right here inside of this file that we're currently in. All right, so you can read more about that online if you want to, but just know that moving forward, if you take the next Python class or if you keep coding, you will always want to have a main function, and you will call your other functions from inside of the main. All right, you can think of this sort of as, how do I say this? This is the part that's actually going to make things happen in your code, all right? We'll always have our functions out here that are waiting on us to use them, but the main function is where what we want to happen, that's where we type it out, okay? And then remember that until we actually call a function, it does not execute. So we have to call the main function or nothing will happen. All right, and that's what these two lines of code, pardon me, that's what these two lines of code here are doing. They are executing the main function. All right, so let's actually give the program a run and let's see what happens. All right, so it is functioning as expected. Remember that when we called our function calc_dozen, we passed in 47. And as we see here, you have 47 cookies in the jar, and that is this print statement right here that's executing. And then it says, let's see how many dozen that is. And the math happens, right? We calculate the value for num dozen. That's returned to where we call our function, and we've created a variable out here on the left-hand side of our function to kind of catch that value when it's returned to us. And then we have a print statement. You have, in our case, 3.91666666 cookies. All right, and remember you guys, we can come in here if we want to, and we could make this like 2 or 3 places after the decimal. so that we don't get quite so many decimal places. And we can run it one more time. And now I should have only 3 places after the decimal. All right. Let's change this up one time just to test it out. Let's say we have 36 cookies and we want to see how many dozen cookies we have. So let's give it a run. And perfect. 36 cookies makes 3 dozen. I should probably put the word dozen in here, huh? So I probably want to do it like this. There we go. Give it one more run. Make sure everything looks good. All right. All right, I hope that makes sense to you guys. If you're still a little cloudy on it, let me know. Or I recommend going out there to YouTube, just typing in Python functions, and maybe hearing it from a different perspective will help you out.